I don't remember where I was the first time I saw Jeremiah Johnson, but I'm pretty sure I was sitting next to my grandfather or my father watching Robert Redford take on the role of a mountain man in the 1800s. When I was growing up, I spent a lot of my time with my grandfather on his couch, on the recliner next to him, watching Westerns. And this one was always a little bit different. This Western wasn't really a Western, was it? It wasn't set in Texas. It wasn't about horses or cattle ranching, or raids onto the prairie, or anything like that. Nothing that we were shown growing up in the 50s and 60s. Things that I was, of course, shown growing up, because that's what my grandfather wanted to watch, and all I wanted to do was be near my grandfather. So watch I did. Jeremiah Johnson was always a different Western, and I think it represents maybe a different tale of the West. And I didn't really appreciate the Mountain West until I started going back and forth to Denver a few years ago. And I used to spend a lot of time out there for other reasons. And I really came to love the Mountain West and see what it was. I think it's amazing. And if I can live there one day outside of Colorado, I will. I thought it was an amazing place. And it opened up, by the way, if you get a chance to go into the Denver Public Libraries to see their Western history collection, it's just absolutely phenomenal. So this brings us around to this film, this Jeremiah Johnson film, which I have watched, golly, probably 100 times in the history of my life, maybe more than that. There is an allure to it that tells the story of this lone, rugged mountain man who cuts his way through the wilderness on his own. This very American story. It's very seductive. And of course, I think what we're going to see today in today's conversation is that it's a fantasy. Today, I've got for you one of my great friends. He's a guy, his name's Jacob Lee. He is a professor at Penn State University. He talks about the borderlands. And he actually wrote about this movie in a book called Riding with Lightning, which is put out by LSU Press a few years ago. And I read the piece and thought, man, Jacob would be this great guy to talk to about this. And he's got these really great ideas about the role of men and women on the frontier, on the borderlands. What is the borderlands? Today, you're going to hear us talk a lot and break down this idea about what are the borderlands? Where's the American frontier? What's the historiography behind a movie like Jeremiah Johnson? What's the role of Jeremiah Johnson in forming notions of what it means to be a man in the 20th century? If you know anything about Jacob, he is a phenomenal scholar. He's got a book out called Masters of the Middle Waters, Indian Nations and Colonial Ambitions Along the Mississippi. It's actually a tremendous book. I've got it on my bookshelf along what I consider like my borderlands shelf. I've got this great bookshelf behind me where I'm talking about these scholars who are writing these really interesting books on the borderlands. As I'm looking up here, I see, all the classic people. I've got David J. Weber, and of course I've got Richard White, and let's see who else I've got up. Kathleen Duvall, of course, and Jacob Lee. And Jacob Lee is amazing because, he's over at Penn State now. And if you know anything about Penn State, or actually, if you don't know anything about Penn State, there was this amazing movement a few years ago where Penn State went and got all these amazing scholars and they already had a great history program. And then it was like, at least looking from the outside, I don't know any of the interior details, but it was like all of a sudden Penn State decided that they were going to just go and grab everybody that they possibly could, right? So they went and got Christina Snyder, and they went and got Rachel Sheldon, and they got Jacob Lee, and they went and got all these amazing, amazing scholars to make this just kick-ass, goddamn amazing history department. So if you're a student out there thinking about, where do I go to study history? You could do a lot worse than Penn State. They've got just this amazing team, and Jacob's one of them. So today I wanted to talk to Jacob. I wanted to talk about this movie, Jeremiah Johnson. I had no idea how long we were going to talk about it, but this conversation goes all over the place. We're going to talk about the movie. We're going to talk about the role of men, role of women, where are Native people in this in these stories, not only in film. We're also going to talk about The Revenant, the Leonardo DiCaprio film, as part of this story as well. We're going to talk about the roles of fathers and sons and the role of movies and making bonds between them. What it's like to live on a borderland. This conversation goes just so many different places. I think you're really going to dig it. I've been a longtime fan of this film. It's always been one of my probably 20 favorite movies. And to be able to sit down and talk to a guy like Jacob who can really elucidate what this movie is trying to say and what it doesn't say completely changed the way I look at this movie. So I hope you're ready for a hell of a ride today. It is going to be an awesome talk. So sit back and relax, get ready, because Jeremiah Johnson is next on the Historians of the Movies podcast. And welcome to Historians of the Movies. I'm your host, benevolent dictator, creator, Jason Herbert. Every single week, if you're new here, we are bringing you top scholars from around the world to talk about the movies that we love. And today, I'm just so geeked out because I've got a fellow Kentuckian, a dude whose work I just love, admire. Jacob, I actually have your book right here.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
This is my friend, Jacob Lee. He's an assistant professor at Penn State University. He is a scholar. He focuses on colonialism and the borderlands. And we're going to talk to you today about a movie I've always absolutely loved. I kind of grew up watching this film. And we're going to have some fun just to kind of talk about it. We're going to talk about Jeremiah Johnson. So, Jacob, thank you so much for being here today. I'm so excited you're here, man.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
All right. I got one question for you right off the bat to hit you with. Coke or Pepsi?
Oh, Coke. Coke. Yeah.
All right. Okay. We can continue on. All right, so talk to me a little bit, so for folks who are not familiar with your work or the history of Borderlands, one of those great questions I think we get moving on before we get into this film is what the hell are Borderlands? What's Borderlands history? What's the difference between the Borderlands and the frontier? This is a question we wrestle with, I think, in graduate school and maybe even in our own scholarship now, certainly as I'm working on my book. And I know that you do this in your own stuff. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit initially about, Masters of the Middle Waters, your first book, and maybe kind of how you come to history and what it is that you do.
Yeah. So, I think that this question about frontiers versus borderlands, you can ask a dozen people who study that and you'll get a dozen different answers. But the way that I have, and obviously frontier has a complicated history, it's so wrapped up with U.S. colonialism across North America. And so I think that, there was a real move, especially in the 80s and 90s, to kind of get away from this term frontier and all the baggage that it carried with it. And I think that there is still value in the term frontier if we can attempt to divorce it from that historical context and think of it more as a place. And if we think about, that all polities, all nations do have these boundaries, which I think it's fine to think about as being frontiers. I think it becomes a problem when you start to think of this as being something that's exclusively about the march of Anglo civilization, as the frontier moving forward and all that. Then it becomes a real, you start to get into some dangerous ground historically and historiographically speaking. But I think that one thing that Borderlands is really useful in thinking about is recognizing that these quote unquote frontiers, and this applies again, I think to any society and thinking about their boundaries and how they butt up against other societies, other cultures, is that the Borderlands helps us think about both sides of this interaction in a more complex way. And so we're not thinking just about, to go ahead and reference the movie, we're not thinking about people like Jeremiah Johnson or Bear Claw, in this unfamiliar world. We're thinking about, okay, they're entering lands that, are the homelands of Shoshones or Utes or Salish peoples, and how are these interactions occurring across those cultural boundaries. And so I think Borderlands helps us kind of get rid of some of that baggage that always comes along with the term frontier, and enables us to think a little bit more complexly about the relations that we're talking about, and also understand these stories from a variety of perspectives.
All right. Well, you're talking about baggage when it comes to the frontier. And I for people who are just now being introduced to this idea of the frontier, and obviously I know that you're probably talking about frontier thesis. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about what kind of baggage it is when we talk about this name that I'm about to hit, that I'm about to say here. Or maybe you can say it for our audience and talk a little bit about the baggage behind the word frontier What happens?
Yeah, so I believe the name that you are alluding to is Frederick Jackson Turner, and the significance of the frontier in American history. His 1893 paper delivered at the AHA in Chicago that year, and its long shadow over the subsequent history of the field of the history of the American West. So Turner approaches this topic of the frontier in very much like a 19th century like stages of civilization way, and like, you know, he talks about if you stand at Cumberland Gap, you can see the development of American society. And, you know, first there are trappers, and then there are miners, and then there are farmers. And, you know, it's very much like an idea that like there are these stages of civilization that eventually build to, you know, kind of like agricultural industrial societies. And of course, Turner's also like, you know, he's living during this era of, you know, US colonization of North America. And so I think that he's reflecting these values that permeate US society in this moment at the end of the 19th century. And so his thesis becomes the way that a lot of historians really up through the middle of the 19th century, you know, with the exception of kind of like the Bolton school that's focused on the Southwest and the Spanish borderlands, except for them, you know, this is really the defining way that history of the U.S. West is approached, is this march across the continent, this development of quote unquote civilization, and that continued to be the dominant thesis up through the middle of the 20th century, and then really wasn't challenged in a substantial way, I think, until really up until the 1980s. And I think that's when you begin to get a lot of people introducing new ways of thinking about this. And as I said, moving away from using the term frontier. Even Richard White famously calls the frontier the F word. And so I think that, yeah, getting away from Turner, getting away from the frontier has been a decades long process. And I think because of movies like Jeremiah Johnson, it's one that we're still,
Mm-hmm.
you know, every class of students that I have come into my American West classes, you know, I have to do some of this work of being like, you have this idea from pop culture about what, you know, the frontier is, what the West is, and we need to think again about these different perspectives. We need to think about not the rugged individualism of Jeremiah Johnson, for example, or of you know, the descendant movie of this, The Revenant, but we need to think about, you know, capitalism. We need to think about colonialism. We need to think about native peoples. We need to think about families. We need to think about social networks. All of these things come together in the history of the West that I think are kind of divorced from the popular culture representations of that subject.
Yeah, this film, I don't know if it does a lot of myth making so much as like myth carrying forward, because I was reading your piece that you had written earlier in another book, and you were kind of talking about that these myths were already existing, and now you just have this movie which kind of transforms it, which is really brought to life on this format. It's no accident, I don't think, that this movie comes out in 1972, because it does do some interesting things, and you pointed this out as well. I want to talk about the environmental aspects of this film, because it's a very seductive movie, and I'm not saying that negatively either.
Yeah, I mean, I think that thinking about this, and I'll get back to your question about the ecological or environmental aspects of it, but I want to hit on this part about it being seductive, right? Because I do think, my background with this movie, I think, is a lot like yours. This is a movie that, I mean, I probably watched this movie a dozen times when I was a kid. It was a movie that, it's like this and The Great Escape and a handful of other kind of like classic like 50s and 60s movies, early 70s movies that I feel like were just kind of like ambient in my childhood. And so like I came into Jeremiah Johnson, I've been aware of this movie for as long as I can remember, and like I feel like it does have this romanticism. It doesn't hurt that like Robert Redford's like one of the great looking men of the 20th century, and so you're like, oh, this guy's looks so cool, and like he's wearing that like cool like flannel red coat, and like he's got like he looks good in the hat, like he's a cool guy out there in the mountains of Utah. And I think that the seductiveness of popular culture representations of the West are like part of this challenge that we face of dealing with this, and of course it's very easy, to just get like wrapped up in this world and like look at the landscapes and you're like, this is so fantastic, and then you start to think about it more critically and you're like, oh, there are like a litany of problems here.
Oh yeah. I want to kick back on a thing that you had just mentioned, actually, which is when you first came to the film, right? Do you remember how, like, with the circumstances behind how you came to this movie? Were you watching it? Did you pick up for new listeners, there was a thing called a VHS in the 1980s. Played around with Laserdisc. I never had it. There was Betamax. Do you remember how you came to the film? Were you watching it by yourself, or did someone watch it with you? Do you remember?
I'm sure that I watched it with my dad. This is a movie that he would have had on. But then it became a movie that I also wanted to watch. And so I'm sure that I was watching it with him, and then he's got like a deep interest in in movies, and I had a real substantial education in like the classic movies of really from like the 30s to the 70s, like hanging out with him when I was a kid. And so Jeremiah Johnson's definitely one of those that I saw a lot watching with my dad.
Yeah, I had the exact same thing, right? In fact, so I turned this movie out. I hadn't seen it in a few years, probably 3 or 4 years. And like you, I've seen it a bunch. And, I was thinking about, it was weird because I turned it on, and the first thing it hits is actually that overture, which you don't get in films anymore, right? I was like, oh, yeah, I forgot about this. But the weird thing was that I turn on the film, it starts playing, and I immediately get flooded with recollections of my late father, right? And I realized, it's like, oh, wait, I remember seeing this for the first time with my father, right? And, it kind of joked a little bit earlier about you and I both being from Kentucky, but, my father was very much a, hunter, fisherman on the Ohio River up in Uniontown in Union County, this very small little area in Western Kentucky, and was kind of a rugged guy. And I remember thinking about this, like, oh, wait, part of his own identity was kind of this fascination with the outdoors, with these mountain folk, right? So he would have been, in his 30s and so forth in the 1980s. When I was growing up, being introduced to this film, and I'm wondering, like, was watching this with him, like this idea of like his own projection to me of like, this is masculinity, right? This is what a man should be. And then I take that in and go, oh, this also, right? So, I wonder about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that, my dad is not and has not been like a hunter or fisherman. But he is very much, he does have like a strong kind of like outdoorsy streak, and so like hiking in the woods and that kind of stuff, like that's a big part of what I think about when I think about, the things that my dad is into. And so I do think that I think that, in a slightly different way, I think that there's that linkage also. And this is something that I've gotten from him also, that like, I love to hike, my family and I go camping, like we're like really into doing those kind of outdoorsy things. And I also think that there's an interesting thing about this movie, which is that there's actually not that much like hunting in the movie, for a movie that is ostensibly about like a fur trapper. There's like not that much of that in the movie. There's a lot of like, oh, there's a hawk, flying overhead, and like, oh, I'm looking at like the shot of the overture is like this guy standing on the cliffside, just like gazing out at the wilderness, And so I think there's a lot of that just like being out in nature that is a big part of this movie. And also a lot of the, as I talk about in that essay that you mentioned, it's also a lot of the like publicity surrounding the movie as well. That like Robert Redford is this guy. Robert Redford like once like it's like shot next to his Sundance property. Like that's where the movie is filmed. And so I think there's also this depiction of like, oh, Robert Redford is this outdoorsman who we are just like showing in his natural element. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of that, both in the way that people view this movie, but also in kind of the like it's both text and extra textual, that like it's in the movie, but it's also, I think, those relationships, both fathers and sons, and also like people and nature. I think like that's all wrapped up in both the movie and the way that people react to it. And I do think that this is very much like a fathers and sons movie. Like, I feel like so many people that I know have come to this movie in that way. People who are about the same age that we are.
Yeah, I've watched this film, with my sons,
Mm-hmm.
not quite successfully. I did not have a phone in my hand when my dad watched this movie with me. I couldn't have watched the TV.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk a little bit actually about, I was going to talk about this later on, but I feel like we should just talk about it now as far as like the circumstances surrounding this movie, like this meta effect. You got this great line actually in the essay when you're talking about how Sidney Pollack confuses Robert Redford leisure for work. I literally laughed out loud when I read it. It was great, right? But very much part of the marketing of this film. And I think, one of the things that's really interesting is this film comes out in 72. So I got shot in 70, 71. We talk about this film as being set in the West, but it's not a Western in the way that we
Right.
consider, those films that were coming out. But there's very much an ecological aspect. This is 10 years after Silent Spring comes out. Maybe we can talk a little bit about like what this film does as far as talking about the environment versus say other films, I don't know, quote unquote Westerns, and what this thing does differently and why that's important.
Yeah, so I mean, I want to set this a little bit like in the context of Westerns of that like late 60s, early 70s moment, because I think there's a lot of taking Western tropes largely from like the previous generation of directors, like John Ford and that like that in like all the John Wayne movies, like that Howard Hawks, like that classic kind of Western film, which of course are like repackaging, much older tropes as well, and it's doing different stuff with them. And so then you have stuff like Little Big Man, which is really thinking about the U.S. wars on Native peoples on the Great Plains, like through the lens of Vietnam and that kind of stuff. You have kind of like the fever dreams of Sam Peckinpah in like The Wild Bunch and other stuff that are just like that are kind of that I mean are definitely like building on these Western tropes of rugged individualism and like encroaching society and all that kind of stuff, but then are also just like over the top, like bloody violence.
Right.
And then I think that where you're getting at, or what you're getting at with Jeremiah Johnson and the ecological aspect, is that this is very much occurring in a moment. This movie comes out in a moment in which there is a revitalized environmentalism throughout U.S. society. This is like, as you mentioned, Silent Spring comes out in 62, and I think is a big part of getting people to think ecologically, recognizing the ways that they are connected with their environment, that it's not, that humans can't just act on the environment and not have any repercussions, and, then by 70, you have the first Earth Day, you have the founding of the EPA, and then you also have, the Back to the Land movement, or like, again, the renewed Back to the Land movement that happens in the same time, where people are like, okay, society is like polluted and like corrupt, and so like let's go back and like we'll go farm and like basically like we're going to recreate homesteading. Except I do think that, again, and I think this is a key aspect both of about the reality of life in the American West and then the depictions, is that a lot of the Back to the Land movement is like about communal living. It's not about like I'm going to go by myself and be a farmer. It's like I have this group of people and we're going to try to create like an ideal society on our plot of land, our own little utopia. And so I think that there's also this tension between communal living and like family networks, that kind of thing, and versus like the individualism that gets shown in stuff like Jeremiah Johnson, because Johnson like gets a family, but he doesn't really want one, and it's like all happenstance, like
Right.
He's just kind of like blown by the winds of fate. It ends up with this makeshift family. But yeah, so I think that what you have in the 70s is this recognition of the need for conservation, of trying to avoid the worst aspects of, pollution and wanton destruction of the natural world. And I think there's a lot of thinking also in that moment about humans it's not like humans and nature, it's like humans as part of nature, that humans don't exist separately from the natural world, but they exist in part as part of it. And also that there's this kind of restorative aspect of again, going back to the land and like building those relations with the earth and with the plants and with the animals, rather than, living separately from it, or just extracting things that you want or need from it.
Well, it's definitely different, like you're saying, because than say the other Western-esque films coming out in the era, right? Because maybe the only bit of nature you're saying, well, John Ford would frame the landscape, and maybe you see some sagebrush, but the engagement with, it's really kind of limited to these frontier towns, or I'm thinking about your classic John Wayne kind of films, which makes I don't think that we'd really seen this on screen the way that it's presented before. Not this, I don't think Americans I certainly wasn't thinking about Utah as the West, even though it's clearly, clearly the West, unless you're from California, you're thinking, oh, Utah's the East, right?
Right.
I'm facing east from Santa Barbara. I want to talk a little bit now about Johnson himself, about like what this film does right, what it does wrong. Maybe you can set the stage for us a little bit better, and talk about who this cat Jeremiah Johnson actually was. Was not what this movie does right, and I'm not real big into saying, "Oh, this movie doesn't do this right," or this is the But we should talk about what it does right and what it does wrong, or where it's taking some liberties. We can definitely talk about the Revenant, because there's some interesting things that's going on with that, with the story of Hugh Glass, and maybe kind of like talk about the making of this man from fact to this myth.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that. So, the movie begins with, I wish I could remember exactly the language now, but it says something like, his origins were unknown, or like, where he came from, nobody knew.
Doesn't really matter.
Yeah. And I think that there is some reality in that. So I'll say that the character of Jeremiah Johnson is loosely based on the life of a guy named John Johnston, who had the nickname Liver Eating Johnston. Because of an alleged act of cannibalism. And there's really not a lot known about Johnston. There's more known about him than there's about Hugh Glass, who's the inspiration for The Revenant. But still, the facts of Johnston's life and especially his origins, are pretty obscure. But there are a few things that I do think are worth noting. One is that chronologically he's active in the Missouri River Valley much later than the movie Jeremiah Johnson is set. And so he's active really in like the 1860s and 70s. And he's active in the context of the U.S. wars against Plains Indians, Lakotas, Cheyennes, Arapahoes in the 1860s and 70s. And he's also active, and there's a vague reference to this in the movie where Bear Claw tells Jeremiah Johnson, that you can cut wood and leave it on the Judith, and riverboat captains will leave you gold, which is actually what Liver Eating Johnston's main job was during this time period, is that he cut wood for steamboats on the Missouri River. And that makes sense because there was also very little in the way of fur trade going on in the Missouri River Valley, really even by the 1840s, but especially in that post-Civil War era. And so then, like a lot of people of his generation, like a lot of men who had some experience in the West, he gets involved in show business, and he begins to, tell stories about his exploits in the West. And at one point, he claims, I think, to have killed like 1,200 Crow Indians. And so this all gets wrapped up again in this myth around him. And so the facts of his life, particularly his early life, are not very well known. And then by the end of his life, a lot of what is associated with him are, just straight up lies that he told is like entertainment. And then he eventually dies in like a veterans retirement home in California around 1900. And so I think that we're dealing with like multiple layers of myth making here, that like the story of Liver Eating Johnston as like a woodcutter on the upper Missouri, providing fuel for steamboats, sometimes scouting for the U.S. Army, like that. Then, he is later producing these myths about his own life, which then get recycled into, some novels and short stories. And then John Milius takes them and sets them back, like a generation and a half before that. And then, does his particular John Milius stuff to to this character. And I will say that as I rewatched the movie this time, one thing that I like about this movie is I think I always see something different in it.
Yeah.
And when I was watching it to write that essay that you're talking about, I was really thinking a lot about what Robert Redford and Sidney Pollack brought to the movie and their particular views. And this time I was thinking a lot about John Milius, who listeners may know is one of the inspirations for Walter Sobchak in The Big Lebowski, is the writer and director of Red Dawn, Conan the Barbarian, did early work on Dirty Harry and is like largely responsible for that character. And so all of his stuff is like really about like rugged masculinity and like the lone hero. And I think that I really saw that reflected in Jeremiah Johnson this time, is like the particular John Milius-ness of this movie.
Oh my gosh, right? So I didn't even know Milius was associated with this film, because I wasn't looking for it, and I'm watching it yesterday, and Milius's name pops up on the screen, and go, oh, that explains it. I see, now I can see this movie through the lens of Milius. I can see this through Red Dawn, right?
Yeah, and so I think that Milius is also, he has his particular ideas about, this very like Hobbesian view of the world, and like, he, in his interviews about this movie and about some of his other work on, kind of Western related films, he talks a lot about, how violent this world was and like how tough people needed to be. And, and he's actually, he thinks that there's like too much ecological stuff in Jeremiah Johnson. He's like, that's not really what this is about. Like the movie that I wanted would have just been like, basically Jeremiah Johnson killing people. Like that's the movie that he wanted to make.
We have a 35-minute montage at the end, only for 2 hours.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. And also the ways that really what this movie is a series of 2 or 3 handers. There's his kind of apprenticeship under Bearclaw, and then he's with Delgue for a while, and then he's with Caleb, and then with Caleb and Swan. And then, as you said, for this last 35-minute montage or so of him just like fighting Crow Indians, he's by himself. And in some ways, I think that like that is that's where Milius wanted this guy to be, just like out in this violent world by himself. But there are so few people in this movie, and there are occasional scenes, like when Johnson and Delgue and Caleb end up at the Flathead, which is a name for Bitterroot Salish people. When they end up at their village, that there's then you see like a group of people, but those are all very fleeting, and like the real, like the heart of the movie is just about 1 or 2 people off by themselves, which I think is very much like a Milius perspective that then also gets, it fits in with Redford and Pollack's views too, but in like a different way. I think that what we see here is kind of the blending of the Milius violence with like the Pollack and Redford ecological back to nature kind of thing that is often, it works as a movie, but when you start thinking about it, you're also a bit like, this doesn't entirely make sense,
right.
Which I think also gets with the seductiveness that you're talking about, that like the movie kind of pulls you in, and then you're just thinking about the landscape, and you're drawn along by the action, and again, kind of by the humor of, things that Bearclaw or Delgue say. But then you put your critical hat on, you're like, there's a lot of stuff in this plot that I don't know how we got from point A to point B,
One of the things I found interesting, certainly as my work has really taken on a toll towards looking at environment and so forth, and we talk about violence, I think that there's actually a violence here that's kind of referenced and we see on screen, but it's not the kind of stuff that Milius would have like. It's not the overt stuff that Milius wants to show, where it's where it's fighting or killing or remains when he like comes across that homestead, and there's this great line actually, and you talked a little bit about this both in the essay and just a moment ago, and Chris Lapp actually, Bearclaw makes this reference right when Johnson gets up to him. He says, "This place has been trapped out since 25." Right. And I'm thinking about actually the violence onto indigenous communities caused by American actions towards the environment, trapping out all the beaver, all the, all of those kinds of animals. I felt like, the transforming the environment and then, of course, forcing those communities to have to react to the fact that there are no beaver here or less beaver or the animals themselves are smaller. We've seen this with, say, in the East when whitetail numbers are dwindled, when elk numbers are just decimated. And then the animals themselves, the ones that survive, are just smaller. They act differently. And how do you engage, these animals who have been here for the entirety of your existence when they're just no longer there? I found that to be an act of violence that, maybe not the Milius kind of one, but just maybe more traumatic.
Yeah, so I think that the violence that is kind of hinted at in this movie, I think that, going back to your question about what does this movie get right and what does it get wrong, a big thing that it gets wrong is the fur trade. That this is a movie that begins with Johnson saying, like, where can I find animals to trap that are worth cash money? And then he gets up in the mountains and Bear Claw, and again, we should note for the listeners, like, that this is a movie that takes place in the mid 1840s. Johnson has his army pants still on at the beginning of the movie. There's an implication that he is, he's fled from the U.S. war against Mexico, and he's seeking refuge up in the mountains, right? And so 1846, 47, the Rocky Mountain fur trade is basically done at that point, at least in the northern parts where Johnson is. There's still fur trade happening lower down, southward. But in the part where Johnson is, the fur trade's done. And in part because of what Bear Claw references, which of these areas being trapped out, which is the product not of individual, like, lone trappers, the way that Johnson is depicted, but of trapping companies organized by Hudson's Bay Company or the Northwest Company or the American Fur Company, John Jacob Astor's operation, or any of the fur trade operations based out of St. Louis, right? That they send brigades of trappers into the mountains who quickly trap out beaver in less than 2 decades. That this kind of fur trade really starts in the upper Missouri River Valley, in the northern Rocky Mountains. I should say in the northern U.S. Rocky Mountains. Canadian Rockies are a different story. But that really starts in the early 1820s. And by 1840, it's basically done. There's the annual rendezvous of trappers and traders that the various fur companies organize over the course of the 1820s and 30s. Last one of those is in 1840. And so Johnson comes into the Rocky Mountains looking to trap animals that cannot be trapped profitably in those areas anymore. And so I think that there are these moments where the movie hints at the history of the fur trade in ways that you're like, oh, I know what this is referencing. Like, if you're familiar with that history, like, oh, I know this is what this is referencing. This is right. That this area has been trapped out. You can't actually do what Johnson wants to do in these areas. And yet the arc of the movie, like the bulk of the movie, is this really weird misrepresentation of the fur trade. And so you have individuals like Johnson, Bear Claw, and Delgue who are operating by themselves, which is not how this worked. There aren't really kind of like lone trappers in this regard. The ways that you would operate are really, there are a couple of options. If you're a lone trapper, you would be deeply involved with a native community, that, like Johnson, you would probably be married to an indigenous woman, but you would be embedded in her community. You wouldn't go off and live by yourself on a creek somewhere the way that it is depicted in the movie. You would be, for all intents and purposes, a member of that indigenous community, or you would be operating in one of these fur brigades, like the American Fur Company or the Northwest Company or whoever would organize, where you would go out and a group of mostly men, but you would be operating in a group, not as an individual operator. And so I think that there's this tension in the movie where it hints at things, and you're like, that's right. Or like when they go to the Bitterroot Salish village and there's the crucifix there, and they reference the French missionaries who've been operating in those communities, you're like, yes, that happened. But then like none of the other stuff makes sense in terms of the history. And so I think that there's this odd attention to detail in some ways on kind of the micro level that doesn't translate to the macro level. And the same thing with the hawk and guns, right? Like that is a very coveted weapon in this time period among fur traders and trappers. And they spend a lot of time talking about the hawk and gun, but then miss this bigger picture about either the corporations who are operating in the fur trade or about the indigenous communities that they're interacting with. And so I think that there's this, it's a weird hodgepodge of, kind of like random facts that are accurate and then like a broader narrative that doesn't really hold up to that kind of historical scrutiny. You
had mentioned a little earlier about how The Revenant is kind of this film's spiritual successor or descendant, if you will. In fact, as I was watching this, thinking about The Revenant, you've got a young Jim Bridger who is referenced by Bear Claw as being bloodkin to the Grizz who bit Jim Bridger's ass.
Right.
Do you think that maybe The Revenant does a little bit better job demonstrating any of this, or is it worse as far as like talking about these companies?
Yeah, I mean, so I do think that The Revenant is better in this regard of showing the kind of the corporate aspect of these fur trading endeavors. That the fur trading part of that, I think, or fur trapping part of that, I think is much better than Jeremiah Johnson. I do think then it like leaves that and then kind of becomes the same like lone man with a vendetta.
John Milius may have ghostwritten The Revenant, is what you're saying?
Yeah, right.
Revenge story. The grizzly bear scene in The Revenant.
Yes, it's a lot. Yeah. But I also think that The Revenant reflects its historical moment also, that it continues this line of like environmental thinking, but also adds this strain about capitalism. And, The Revenant comes out in this moment, like kind of post, recession, post Occupy Wall Street, and so there's a lot of thinking about kind of the flaws of capitalism, and then also, of course, this moment of climate change. And so I think that it's bringing those two strands together, and you can see the ways that is. And, as I mentioned in the piece, like DiCaprio and Iñárritu are explicit about this in a lot of their interviews, that this is the message of their movie, is about like environmental devastation, as people are searching for profit. But I do think that in terms of its depiction just of like how the fur trade would, or how these fur brigades would have operated, that like that's all right. That like it is at least reflects that reality more than just having like a lone guy go off into the quote unquote wilderness to trap these animals himself, or by himself. That this is that depiction, at least, of the company, of the fur brigade, of also kind of the the Donald Gleason character is also kind of like, I don't care about this, right? Like, I'm interested in the money,
right.
Like that's my ambition here. And so I think that those aspects of The Revenant are a little truer to the actual history about this. It's not going out and communing with nature. It's about killing animals so you can take their furs and sell them to people in St. Louis, who will sell them to people in Montreal, who will sell them to people in England, who will turn them into fancy hats. That's what this story is. And, if you see some pretty mountains along the way, well, bonus, but like, that's not the point of what is happening here. And like you said, referencing the line in the article, like, this isn't about like being a naturalist or, going out and hiking. This is about making money for yourself, for your employer, on down the line.
Yeah. It's just like, the way it was marketed, Jeremiah Johnson, certainly back in the 70s, and they were talking about this. Oh, Redford likes to go out in the woods. He likes to ride his horses. This is a nice thing to do. He is really, Redford could have, Pollock's out there shilling. Redford is like, oh, he could have been Jeremiah Johnson.
Right.
This is a brutally difficult life. And that's part of the reason why you have to go out in companies of it. It's just such a hard life
Yeah.
to live. I think the Revenant actually does a good job of just of demonstrating the difficulty of this.
Mm-hmm.
I have a hard time watching The Revenant. I can watch Johnson anytime. It's just beautifully shot. It's, like we're talking about, it's very seductive. It's alluring. There's this romantic quality to it, even though there are some really horrific things that happen in the film.
Mm-hmm.
Revenant, I just watch it and I feel cold. It's dark
Yes.
and cold, and I
Yes.
don't want to watch
Yes.
it anymore. It's difficult to come across.
Yeah. I mean, I think that even now I can see all of these faults in the movie, but it's still kind of a fun movie. Like I think if you can turn off that historian brain for a little bit, and also like the movie kind of, I don't know, like you said, it kind of tricks you into doing that too.
Mhm.
That you're just like then riding along, and we're like, oh, I'm right in this. But I do want to mention, as you said, like about the hard work of this, that both of these movies do really a pretty bad job of depicting who would have done the bulk of this labor, which is Native women.
Yeah, I was hoping we'd get to that. Where are the
Yeah.
women?
Yes. Right. And so again, like I think that there are moments where you're like, oh, this is like hinting at this thing that happened a lot, and then it's like telling it in a really kind of twisted, distorted way. And so we'll go back to when Johnson marries Swan. A lot of trappers did have native wives, or if they operated farther south, they married Mexican women. There are a lot of cross-cultural marriages in the fur trade, and that's something that is true really from the 17th century through the end of the fur trade in the early 19th century. That there are these cross-cultural marriages, and a lot of trappers of European descent are marrying native women, and native women are doing lots and lots of work as part of the fur trade. And this is true whether if they're involved in the fur trade, like they're doing a lot of the work of preparing hides, of feeding the men who are doing the trapping or hunting. And this is true in the deerskin trade in the southeast. This is true in the fur trade in the Great Lakes. This is true in the context of the Missouri River fur trade that Jeremiah Johnson depicts. Like women in both the Revenant and Jeremiah Johnson, they largely serve as victims and like as plot catalysts,
Mhm.
and are not depicted as, I mean, they're not even really depicted as like full characters. I actually think that Johnson does a little bit better with this in terms of the depiction of Swan. But if I remember correctly, the only women in the Revenant are Hugh Glass's wife, who we see in flashbacks, who is killed by U.S. soldiers, and then that serves as like part of his, it basically like serves as like part of his origin story. Like that's the function of this. And then there are native women who seem to be working as sex workers at like the fur trade fort. But we see very few women in either of these movies in substantial roles. And I think that in a lot of ways that is the biggest flaw with both of these movies in terms of how they depict the fur trade, is that it's so focused on masculinity and so focused on kind of like male toughness and bravery and those kinds of things, that it just totally removes those characters from the social worlds that they would have actually operated in. And for listeners who are interested in learning more about this, there's so much great work about the fur trade and about relations between European and Euro-American fur traders and Native women in particular. Susan Sleeper Smith's work is fantastic. That'd be the place that I would go to start. But then you also have Anne Hyde's book about the early 19th century West, which is also really great. And so I think that if you read those books, you get a much clearer sense, well, first, that men are not operating by themselves, first of all. Like they're part of either social networks or in like existing native communities, or they're part of corporations. That they're the lone individual trapper like doesn't really exist in the way that is depicted in these movies, or in particularly in Jeremiah Johnson. And then the other aspect is that like there are always women involved in the fur trade. And so it's also not the intensely masculine spaces that both of these movies depict. And I think that that's the real, that if I had to or if I had to like choose one thing that I was like, this is the biggest flaw in these movies, it's the depiction of women, and particularly Indigenous women. And I don't think that you can tell an accurate story about the fur trade if you're not talking about Indigenous women, which I think that in some ways that brings us back to that question that you opened with about frontier versus borderlands. And that I think that what Borderlands history allows us to do is to tell these stories that are as much about Native women as they are about the white male stereotype of so much frontier history and frontier popular culture. And I think that both Jeremiah Johnson, and The Revenant are frontier stories. You know, they're in that tradition of frontier myth and frontier narrative. They're not really that interested, even as they depict some Native people, they're not really that interested in Native people. They're interested in like what these environments tell us about like white masculinity.
Absolutely. So if we can pull that though, one of the things I like to be able to think about with these films is, okay, at least they get to allow us to open up these discussions just a little bit more. Say, okay, what's not in here? Just like when we go into the archive and we see there's silence, certainly like with maybe what, Johnson's past is, we can start to imagine maybe a little bit about what that might tell us or think about and so forth. And what I'm really keying in on here, thinking about is, certainly we know that Johnson doesn't survive, or, you're talking about these frontier operators, these hunters trappers. They don't survive without Indigenous women. They don't survive without these links to Indigenous communities, right? But I'm also kind of wondering, and this is a thing that the film doesn't focus on, because the Johnson versus Crow aspect is really the second half of the film, and there's very much a violent aspect to that relationship. I'm kind of wondering if maybe we can talk a little bit about, like, how did these relationships benefit Indigenous communities? Where because people were marrying in. You do have offspring, children born from these marriages. How do these relationships between trappers, traders, settlers benefit? Is there a benefit to these Indigenous communities? What do these communities get out of this as well? Because we don't get an exchange that we only see a handful of times, where Johnson's maybe trading with folks in like a peaceful manner. Obviously Johnson starts to learn language.
Right.
What's the benefit for Native folks during this time period?
So I think that there is an important distinction that we do need to make, which is between trading and trapping. And so there is the earlier era of the fur trade is largely about trading. And so you have mostly Francophone fur traders who are traveling into Indigenous communities and trading for furs that Native people have trapped or hunted and processed and have ready for trade. And this builds on much, much older trade networks. And so, for example, we know that there was a Shoshone rendezvous in the kind of Intermountain West that predates the rendezvous of the fur companies in the 1820s and 1830s. And so there are Indigenous networks of trade that expand across the interior of the North American continent, and the fur trade with Europeans is largely grafted onto that. And so the benefit of trade is the same thing that it would be for lots of other people. Like you have a product that you have a lot of bison robes, or you have a lot of beaver pelts, and you're like, all right, I don't have a horse, so like I'm going to trade the thing that I do have for the thing that I want. And Ned Blackhawk's book is really fantastic about some of Violence Over the Land, is really fantastic about some of these, really explaining some of these dynamics. Also, in thinking about the introduction of horses, thinking about the introduction of guns, how that changes relations between Native societies. And so part of the benefit of the trade is access to goods that give you an advantage over your rivals. And also just like things that are useful, like kettles, copper kettles, which can both be used as kettles that are preferable in a lot of ways to ceramics, but can also be turned into a variety of things. Like one thing that we see in archaeological sites across the Americas are copper kettles that have been transformed into other goods. And so a lot of this is just the benefit of exchange. A lot of it is about relations between Indian nations. And so there are rivalries between Utes and Blackfeet and Salish people and Comanches and Lakotas. And so we need to think about those like dynamics between different native societies also. And if we're thinking about how this benefits those communities. But then we get to trapping, right? And what fur companies begin to do in the 1820s is they were like, it's kind of hard to carry all of these goods up into the Rocky Mountains to trade them for furs. Why don't we just send our guys up there and they'll do the trapping, and then they'll bring the furs. They'll bring the furs back, and they'll just live up there year round. And it'll cut out transportation costs. They'll cut out, us having to procure a lot of these materials and then transport them long distances. But then what that does is it cuts out a lot of native communities from the benefits of the trade, because they are no longer producing those furs for market. It's white traders white trappers who are doing that work. And I think that you get hints of this in Jeremiah Johnson also, as they reference some of the different native communities that they talk about, where they say like, oh, we're trespassing on so-and-so's land. And so I think that once that transition from trading to trapping happens, that there is a lot more animosity between white intruders and native people, because they see these people not as potential allies, not as bringing them stuff that they want, but they see them as economic threats. They see them as, they're trespassing on our land. They are wantonly killing beaver, and this is detrimental to us. And that's also what happens at the beginning of The Revenant, although it's not depicted that way in the movie. But the reason Arikaras attack the Ashley fur expedition in 1823 is because the arrival of all of these trappers from Missouri is going to upset the place that Arikaras have in the economic relations of the Missouri River Valley. And so I think it's important to draw that distinction between where the trade goods, where the fur's coming from, who is having access to those. And so the relationships around trade, I think, really do, native people often see those as being very beneficial. But then when that transition to trapping happens, then these white men who are coming in and killing beaver and whatever else, like they are intruding on native land in a way that is often very unwelcome.
Yeah, right. You're not only just taking the resource. If we look at things like beaver or deer or bison, they're not just animals. They are resources that affect not only just the ability to sustain or trade, but like you're saying in the case of the Arikara, right? Their trade networks solidified, reinforced their geopolitical position on the continent, right? So right. You take that out, that destabilizes the entire community itself. It's a threat to the livelihood of that community. It's not just about animals. It's about the livelihood of the folks.
Right. And then the other thing that we should talk about a little bit is the rivalry between different fur companies, because the Hudson's Bay Company and then the Northwest Company, they're British companies, as opposed to the American Fur Company or the various fur companies based out of St. Louis. And this occurs, to use the word you just used, like this occurs within a geopolitical rivalry between the United States and Great Britain. And there are orders given by British fur company operators to go into certain regions and annihilate beaver populations because it will deprive American trappers of those profits, or will push them into different places that are away from British territorial claims. And so there's an effort by these British fur companies in the 1820s and 1830s to create what they call fur deserts, where there's just no reason for American trappers to go after the British have come in and harvested all of these beaver pelts. And so I think that the ramifications of that on native people, I think, is obvious, right? That you've gone into their homelands and just like made certain animals basically go extinct in those areas. And so again, at that point, this becomes a very detrimental practice to those indigenous communities.
Yeah, I want to say Dan Flores' new book talks a lot about this and really illustrates that Wild New World. He talks a lot about the creation of of these fur deserts and this ecological warfare on the part of one company versus another that obviously has even more effect on the indigenous communities whose land and animals those belong to.
And I mean, also, like, this is something that a lot of native writers and native scholars talk about also, that there are just fundamentally different relationships between native people and the animals that they are interacting with than there is between white trappers and beaver, right? And so, like, native people do use they do hunt, they do trap, all of these things, but they're not doing the kind of like exterminationist harvesting of pelts the way that British and American fur companies are doing. And Nick Estes talks a lot about that in his book, Our History is the Future. And so I think that, like, there are just different cosmologies at work also. Like, even if we can, on a certain level, like the economic and political and diplomatic aspects of these, there's some similarities. Like, we also need to step back and be like, the American and British fur trappers that are coming in are engaging in practices that are totally divorced from how native people would have harvested these same resources, and that they're often thinking very short term. They're thinking about their rivalries with other European or Euro-American groups, and they're not thinking about like maintaining this as like as a renewable resource, as like something that you always have to rely upon.
Do you have a favorite scene from this film at all?
I was thinking about this as I was rewatching it, and I think that I am really taken with Bear Claw Chris Lapp, and he's very funny, despite the casual misogyny that many of the characters, possess. And there's also something really funny about how bad Jeremiah Johnson is at everything in the early part of the movie. And I think I really like the character of Bear Claw. And so it's not necessarily a favorite scene, but I think that section of the movie, for example, when they are, when Bear Claw and Jeremiah Johnson are hunting that elk,
mm-hmm.
and they're sneaking out behind their horses, and Jeremiah Johnson is like, what if he sees our feet? And he's like, elk don't know how many feet horses have. They're like, there's a series of funny things that Bear Claw says that I think are really entertaining. And so it's not so much a favorite scene as it is just like that section where he's with Bear Claw initially, I think is probably my favorite part of the movie. What about you?
Well, it's very much like the elk, the horse feet kills me every time. I laughed again when I heard him say it, right? It's also a really necessary aspect of this film, because otherwise Johnson doesn't survive. And in fact, it's the thing we have to talk about is the fact that a lot of these quote unquote mountain men don't live very long lives. They die very early because, Johnson shows up and says, oh, I'm just going to go hunt critters on the mountains. And you see this when he's in the stream, when he paints his shirt red. Paints his shirt red, I think. Yeah. Paints his shirt red, and he's got all that trout just hanging from his stirrups. Johnson's not good at this, and Bear Claw saves him. And you have to have this mentorship aspect, because so it's also Bear Claw is needed levity to a film, because you can't have this story without some level of fun.
Right. And The Revenant does not have a Bear Claw.
You're absolutely right. And maybe that's the reason why Revenant's so hard to watch, because it's 2.5, 3 hours of real, it takes a lot from you to watch that film.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas here, even when there are scenes with, say, Del Gue, who is just not a likable guy at all.
No.
He's really awful, but he's also a necessary guy who teaches Johnson about communication and customs. When they go into the village, he's like, look, you have to accept it. Why would you offer him why would you offer him a gift? You have to do these things. This training, his training montage is almost, I was watching a Rocky montage this morning.
Yes, yeah. It's Jeremiah Johnson like running up the mountain, and like
Yeah.
boxing in the freezer, with the side of meat. Like that's what a lot of the early part of the movie is for sure.
Right. And then there's this conclusion, say, with Bear Claw towards the end where he's like, "You've come far, Pilgrim." He's like
Hmm.
this acknowledgement that Johnson has like managed to survive.
Yeah, and so but I think that this, I think that this gets back at a couple of the other things that we've talked about, right? That it's that of course that would have happened, like any mountain man who survives does so because of those kinds of connections,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I think that the way that it's presented in this movie is that Delgue and Bearclaw give Johnson some of the things that he needs to survive, but really the way that he comes into this, I don't know, like culmination of all of this training, a lot of it is individual, like in that, again, that 35-minute montage you talk about of like him, fighting and escaping ambushes and all that kind of stuff. And it's very much, I think it's about a white man going into the wilderness and like proving himself, and like the way that being in nature like changes you on a fundamental level. Like I think that's kind of the message of this movie, which of course is this older, much older kind of trope about relations between men in the wilderness. Going back really to like Daniel Boone, is like the wilderness is where you become a man. Like I think that's the kind of like masculinity that this movie is engaged in. And again, I think it's one of these moments where you're like, that's kind of right, but it's like distorted in this particular way, either by like the 2 centuries of stereotypes about the frontier and wilderness, or by Redford and Milius and Pollock's very particular ideas. But yeah, I think that you're right that like there's kind of this tension in the movie in which Johnson can't survive as an individual, in the early stages, but then like the frontier and the wilderness are where he proves himself.
I want to talk about another sense of survival when it comes to this film, which is the GIF.
Oh yeah, the one of Zach Galifianakis.
Exactly. Well, I kind of wonder. First of all, have you ever used this film in your courses? And are your students familiar with this? Are the students that come to you at Penn State, are they familiar with this movie at all? Do people know this GIF or like where it's from? I'm fascinated with this GIF because it's one of the most, and I'm not even having to describe it because I think people know exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, the smiling,
The
nodding.
smiling, nodding. Johnson
Yeah,
has recognized he is like come to his place where he is legitimately happy.
yeah.
The nod. I think he's nodding at Swan and Caleb, right?
Hmm.
And it's like, okay, I'm happy here. And of course, people
Yeah.
use it for any number of things.
So I think that there is some familiarity with the movie still among people who, I think grew up in like households similar to ours,
Mhm.
where, there are like lots of movies on the TV. But then there are also a lot of people who this does in some ways seem to be a movie that you're either familiar with or you're not. There's no like, I'm kind of familiar with this movie. It's
Yeah,
either like I've seen this movie 12 times or I've never heard of this.
right.
Yeah. And one thing that was fascinating about the GIF is like you, I saw it all over the internet and I was like, oh yeah, people are using this Jeremiah Johnson GIF. And then to find out that like so many people didn't know what this was from.
Don't even
And
recognize
like
it as
there was,
Redford.
right. And like people were like, oh, I thought that was Zach Galifianakis, which is also hilarious because no offense to Zach Galifianakis, but he and Robert Redford do not look alike. Like, and I just think that this is amazing that this GIF in some ways has a life that is completely divorced from its source material.
Mhm.
In some ways it's a reflection, I guess, of how the internet just like chops up culture and reorganizes it, and they're just like bits and pieces of every bit of music and movie,
Mm.
circulating disconnected from their context. Yeah, I think the afterlife of that GIF is really fascinating,
Absolutely.
even though I don't have anything particularly smart to say about it.
Well, there are other GIFs I think about. I use one a lot from Tombstone where it's the well by
Yeah, Curly Bill, is
Curly
that?
Bill. Yeah, Curly
Yeah,
Bill.
Powers Booth. Yeah, that's a
Powers Booth. We could do a pod on Powers Booth any dime you want because he's
Yeah,
fascinating.
yeah. There's only one Powers booth.
Did you ever see Southern Comfort? Do you know
Yes.
this movie?
Yeah, yeah. It's got one of the Carradines in it.
Yep.
And is
Powers booth. Fred Ward.
yeah, but it's like Vietnam, but in
Louisiana Bayou.
the swamps of Louisiana.
I think the movie's fascinating. I'm dying to do a pod on it at some point in time where I could talk about growing up in Louisiana as well. Southern Comfort doesn't do very well in audiences in the States. I think it's really fascinating. It's this whole other story of like treating Cajuns as this other people. You know, it's this semi-mystical folks who have this relationship with the land. And I'll save that for or this pod will go 3 hours.
Right.
I want to kind of pull this back a little bit. And we've talked a lot about, and you've brought up a few different scholars that have talked about borderlands, indigenous communities, and things like that. And certainly your own work focuses in on the borderlands, both with the book you've already published and the one that you're working on now. I'm kind of wondering if maybe you can talk to our readers just a little bit, maybe about maybe give us like 3 books that you found to be really influential, or kind of talk about how you ended up as a borderlands scholar. Like, how do you arrive where you're at now? What got you to where you're at?
Yeah, I mean, so my first book is about kind of the central Mississippi River Valley over the course of several centuries, from the era of the Mississippian city Cahokia through the early 19th century. And I think that in a lot of ways, the book that I am like most deeply inspired by and was most kind of captivated with early in my grad student career and then subsequently is Kathleen Duvall's The Native Ground, which and I will say that she and I shared an advisor. I had come to the book before I went to graduate school, and so it's not quite that.
Can I jump in for a sec?
Sure.
So on my bookshelf, your book sits about 3 books to the right of The Native Ground. On like that's kind of like mentally where I've got actually Violence of the Land is right there. Taylor's book is there. There's a whole Boltonian section. But yeah, go on.
Yeah, and so I think that what Kathleen's book did is it changed the way that I thought about these histories, and it made me think about long chronologies and also the connections. It broke down this artificial distinction between quote unquote prehistory and history. And like history does not begin with the arrival of white people in North America. That
crazy,
right? And so I read The Native Ground, I think, at a time when I was really trying to think about early American history in a more complicated way, and that kind of provided me with a way to do that and showed me that it was possible. And yeah, so The Native Ground's a fantastic book. And it's one of the books that continues to influence me. I also am a big fan of Brian DeLay's War of a Thousand Deserts, about Comanche and Kiowa raids into Texas and Mexico during the 1820s and 30s, and how that and 40s, and how that really makes us rethink the outcome of the U.S.-Mexico War, and that we can't understand the quick U.S. victory in that if we don't understand this native history of the preceding decades. And I think that, again, that book came at a moment when I was trying to really figure out my own thinking about these histories. And, there's something really powerful about learning that this event in U.S. history that you thought that you knew and didn't in any way associate with Native people can't be understood unless you spend a lot of time trying to figure out and trying to understand and integrate indigenous peoples into those narratives. The final book that I'll mention, which has been an inspiration for me, is Elliot West's The Contested Plains, which, as I've gone farther into my career and done more research, and I've gone back to it, I have some real critiques of his analysis of this history, but he's a beautiful writer. And I think that's something else that is kind of continues across the books that I really love, is that history should be accessible, and you should be telling a story that that brings people along with you. And, I think that reading West's book, again, even if I have some critiques of his analysis, that I do really admire his writing and think that he's just an exceptional writer. And, that's a book that I could give to, anyone who's interested in Western history, and they can read that book and, get a lot out of it. And so I think that it's a model in terms of writing. And that's something that I think is absolutely crucial, if we're thinking again about how we kind of bridge, our academic work with, with like the popular culture stuff that we're talking about in this podcast in relation to these films, is we got to be able to tell a story,
Thank you. Right. Like, I can't teach you if I can't get you to turn the page.
Right.
I think maybe there was an older guard that said, oh, pretty writing is just a sign for bad scholarship. And I just don't think that's the case. I think it's actually, I think you really got to be able, if we can't communicate this stuff, I'm always looking for great, of course, great scholarship is great, but if you can't write, I can't read you. And there's some big names out there that I just can't read because I just get bogged down. What about films? Are there other films that you like that talk about the borderlands at all? We've talked about 2 here. Are there other things that you like?
So I tend to come at Western films in particular, not so much from the perspective of what does this tell us about, the 18th or 19th century West, because I don't think very many Western films are actually interested in that. I don't think they're actually interested in the history itself. I think what they're interested in are the myths about the West. Mm-hmm. And so that's how I tend to come at Western films. And, like I mentioned, I grew up watching all kinds of Westerns, like I feel like I'm really steeped in that particular genre, and only later kind of came back at this with a critical eye and be like, oh, these all fit together, and kind of like these recycled narratives that go back to the 17 or even 1600s. And so that's kind of where I come at this. And so I'm going to give you some films that I think are interesting to think about from this perspective of myth, or this perspective of ideas about what the West and the frontier mean, more so than movies that I think actually depict borderlands in a good way, because I don't really think there are very many of those. But some movies that I think are interesting to talk about. First, I'm going to start off with an oddball in terms of this, which is John Huston's The Misfits. Ooh. From 1961, starring Clark Gable, Eli Wallach, and Marilyn Monroe. And the thing that is fascinating to me about this movie is, and I'm not even sure that this is what it is trying to do, but Gable and Wallach's characters in particular have these particular ideas about work and the West and living in the West, and how to maintain kind of like this free cowboy existence in the 20th century West. And so I think that it's in some ways it's an updated version of a lot of the kind of like closing of the West kind of movies that are prevalent throughout the genre. Whether you want to talk about The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, mm-hmm. or something like well, I'm just going to give away my next movie, which is The Wild Bunch, but again, like a closing of the West.
Go ahead.
Yeah. And so I think that this closing of the West subgenre gets at these ideas about the West, because it's like, okay, these tough, rugged men have, quote unquote, won the West, right? And like made it safe for civilization. But what is their place in this now? And I think that Peckinpah is, updating those in his 1969 movie, The Wild Bunch, but then also bringing his particular like Peckinpah madness to it.
Has to be an influence on Milius, doesn't it? I mean, it has to be.
I'm sure. Yeah. And so The Wild Bunch is, I find Peckinpah to be endlessly fascinating as a director, even though I find much of what he depicts to be abhorrent. and it also gets back to this long running debate about film, about whether depiction is approval. And Peckinpah is one of these directors. I'm like, with somebody like Scorsese, I'm like, I don't think Scorsese like thinks mobsters are like cool guys, which I feel like is one of the critiques of him, is like, oh, he like thinks that Henry Hill is like so cool, or that or to use a more recent movie, that Jordan Belfort is like, he's a cool guy that like everyone should be like. And like, I don't think that's true with Scorsese. It may be true with Peckinpah, that like I'm not sure exactly what Peckinpah is up to a lot of the time. And so I find him to be someone who's really interesting to think about, and also to think about him really leaning into like the dirty, filthy, violent aspect of these stories in a way that is a rejection of like the John Ford, Howard Hawks view of these narratives. And then my final movie is a more recent one, which is Kelly Reichardt's First Cow. I kind of went back and forth about whether or not I was going to do First Cow or Meek's Cutoff, which I think is in some ways an interesting companion piece to to Jeremiah Johnson. Meek's Cutoff is, because one of the characters is so for those who don't know, Meek's Cutoff is about this wagon train. I can't remember if it's on the Oregon. I think it's on the Oregon Trail, and the guide of this is a mountain man who, like many mountain men who survived the years of the fur trade, are working as guides and scouts and that kind of thing. But as opposed to Jeremiah Johnson, this mountain man in Meek's Cutoff is like totally full of shit, that like everything he does is the wrong thing, and like gets the wagon train in a bad situation. Also, the movie is very focused on the women in these families, which I think is a really welcome reprieve from a lot of the so overtly masculine depictions of the West. And Michelle Williams is the star of the film, and she and the women characters are really the core of the story. And I think that's an interesting corrective. But I kind of went back and forth on that one in First Cow. And I went with First Cow because it is, in a lot of ways, it's a very gentle movie. And it's about this relationship between an Anglo man in Oregon, early Oregon Territory, and a man from China, and they form a business together as selling baked goods, which is made possible because they are stealing milk from this guy's cow. And it's a movie that's about capitalism in the West, and is about also the connections between these people living in the West and like broader global economic networks and that kind of stuff. I mean, it doesn't quite draw the line that explicitly, but that's where we're going, I think, with a lot of the narrative of the movie. But it's also a really interesting depictions of homosocial spaces. And so it's not about like traditional masculinity, traditional like American masculinity in the way that Johnson or the Revenant are, but it's a compelling depiction of the relationships that form between men in predominantly male spaces in a really gentle way. And so I think that, going back to referencing some, or referring to some history books, is that it reminds me in some ways of Susan Johnson's book about the California Gold Rush, and thinking about gender in more complicated ways than just like being tough and brave and those sorts of things. But I think that Kelly Reichardt, who directed both Meek's Cutoff and First Cow, I think she has some really interesting ideas about the West and about these long-running stereotypes about the West. But I think that both those movies are interesting additions to this ongoing conversation about the meaning of the West and about gender in the West.
Are you watching any of Taylor Sheridan's stuff?
Yeah, so I am not up on Yellowstone or any of its mini spinoffs, but I did watch. I've seen most of the films that he's been involved in, and I think that Sheridan's work is interesting in the context of the Western genre because he does. I think that in his movies there are some critiques of those genres, but he also can't quite escape. He can't quite escape fetishizing, like rugged masculinity. But I think that Hell or High Water is probably the best thing that he has produced. And again, I think that it's interesting in part because of it is overtly engaging with these narratives about the West and thinking about how the two brothers at the core of the story, and particularly, Ben Foster is like repeatedly referring to like the lords of the plains and the Comanches and those sorts of things as though he's like
literally has a standoff with a Comanche.
Right.
In I think in a casino, if I recall.
Yes. And so he had like there are these interesting ways that these myths and stereotypes kind of get cut up in Sheridan's work and are repurposed. But I do think that he has this kind of same tendency that a lot of Western writers and directors do, which is kind of to center really on this kind of like rugged masculinity as being like the Western archetype that matters. So I think that overall, I think his work is interesting, and I don't think that it's quite as. I think that he's more thoughtful about a lot of issues than a lot of his counterparts, but is maybe not quite as thoughtful as he thinks he is about these things. But overall, I found a lot to enjoy in the works of his that I've seen.
I'm happy to see the West showing back up in pop culture. In even say in situations where, say, like when we're talking about Jeremiah Johnson or The Revenant or Sheridan's work or anybody else, right? Because it just gives us the opportunity to engage and say, hey, this is what's being presented, this is what's not being presented, and this is why, right? And be able to talk about these things.
Yeah, and so and like I'm very interested in the way that these narratives are constructed and repurposed, and that you can see all of these echoes. Like once you start paying attention, going back into for 200 years or more, I think that that's a really fascinating history in and of itself, and to think about all of these newer Westerns, how they are playing with those stereotypes and which ones are they intentionally or not kind of furthering. I just think that's a really fascinating way of approaching these different works, and it's a reason why I keep thinking about Jeremiah Johnson, is because it has a relationship going back in time and then also continuing on into The Revenant and other works as well. And so I think placing it not in the history of the fur trade necessarily, but placing it in the history of those kind of undying Western stereotypes, I think is really fascinating.
Well, I guess maybe that brings us up to maybe our final question here today, which is the big thing we've been building up towards now that we've got Coke versus Pepsi out of the way, of course, is that is Jeremiah Johnson a history film?
So I don't think that it is. And I think that a lot of Western set movies are not actually history films. I think that they're films about myth and about storytelling. I don't watch Westerns to learn about the 18th or 19th century. I don't think that there's that much really to be gained in that regard. And I'm also not entirely sure that the directors believe that they are telling you stuff about this history, or the writers. I think that often what they are doing is that they are using the West and all of the baggage that comes with the West as a place to think about other ideas about masculinity. I think is the one that runs through the course of this. But then also by the time you get to the 60s and 70s, you have people thinking about colonialism again through the West, which is of course a very obvious one. And then ecology and capitalism, and the West is a setting that allows you to think about whatever ideas you're interested in with that backdrop. Westerns in general tend to not be history movies. I think they tend to be movies about myth and narrative.
Well, look, Jacob, thank you so much for being here. I want to tell our listeners where they can find the myth of Jacob Lee. Like, where can we find you? Where do people find you online and learn more about what you're doing?
Well, I am largely off of social media these days, so I'm hard to find online, and that's a welcome change. But if you want to know more about my thinking about issues related to the fur trade and whatnot, my book is available. Masters of the Middle Waters, available from Harvard University Press. And
what's the new book about?
The new book. I'm working on a book about legal jurisdiction and sovereignty in Indian territory, and so picking up the story kind of in the era of Indian removal and thinking about, again, a lot of these borderlands issues of, interactions between Native peoples and colonialism, but particularly through this lens of legal jurisdiction, which I think explains a lot of really key conflicts between indigenous nations and the U.S. government in the era of Indian removal and afterward, because indigenous nations, they have their own systems of governance and own systems of law enforcement, and they have their own ideas about like what a state should do, which are often in competition with the ambitions of the U.S. federal government, but also with the state governments that border them. And so thinking about these relationships in kind of over the course of the 19th century through the lens of legal jurisdiction, that's what I'm thinking about these days. So continuing along with this borderlands history and thinking about multiple perspectives and how, taking all of these people seriously really produces a more complex history of the American West in the 19th century.
Well, look, man, thank you so very much for being here today. I can't thank you enough, man. I wanted to do this movie. I definitely wanted to talk to you about it because like I said, I'd read your essay you had written in Writing History with Lightning, and just loved it. So thank you so much for being here. I really just appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And now I think I'm going to go try to find that dumb pilgrim that I've been hearing for 20 days and smelling for 3.
That may be me. And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so much to our guest, Jacob Lee, for sitting in here today and talking to us about this movie. It was absolutely amazing, and I feel like I've just learned a ton. I'm still going to have to process as I watch this movie the next time over and over again. Thank you again to our producer, Fletcher Powell, who keeps the show running. Could not make the show without him, so thank you so much. And of course, we couldn't make the show without you, dear listeners. So thank you so much for being part of the HATM community. Thanks for listening in. Please continue to like, share, and subscribe this podcast as we're trying to grow this. If you want to learn more about HATM, you can follow me at Herbert History on Twitter or look for the hashtag HATM. This weekend, we're not doing a film. We're going to be live tweeting the Oscars, I think for the 4th or 5th time. So make sure you tune in for that. Again, Sunday night, you can look for us, hashtag HATM. Have a great week, everybody. Thank you so much for being part of this, and we will talk to you soon. Ciao for now. Bye.